Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Things. I'm John Voorhees, and with me as always is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We've got a big show today, but before we dive in too deep, I want to go back and have another iPadOS wish. Will you grant me just one more iPadOS wish? All right.
Sure, go for it.
I was thinking about this week because I've been trying to do a little more exercise over the lockdown period, and I kind of find it annoying that the activity app isn't on the iPad. I mean, maybe it's an app that needs to be expanded in terms of what it offers before we see it on the iPad. But I like to check where I am on my rings, or maybe look back at how much I've exercised over the past week from my iPad just as much as I do from my phone. So I'd really like to have that on the iPad too.
Yeah, that's a good one, especially because activity data is now stored in iCloud and has been for the past couple of years.
Right.
So I could see a scenario where on the iPad you would have like this dashboard of activity data that would go beyond what you can see on the iPhone, right? So I can imagine like this sort of dashboard with multiple charts and multiple graphs and lots of information displayed at once. It'd be pretty sweet, actually, to have that data on the iPad where you can get a maybe a deeper overview, and that also applies to health, I think, because
it does.
It's the same set of data. Activity data is a subset of health data. So, and that's stored in iCloud. So I don't see why it shouldn't be on the iPad. The only argument, of course, is that the iPad would only be for viewing that data instead of collecting data, and I think that would be fine.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think with a column, a multi-column layout of some kind, you could go from what is the very broad overview information that you see when you first open the app on the iPhone, for instance, and then drill down into various levels from there and maybe customize charts and graphs and things like that. I would love that, but we'll see, I guess. All right, Federico, I want to get into the meat of the topic today because that is imagining the perfect research app. And I guess, spoiler, there is no such thing, I don't think. We have been looking high and low for the perfect research app that, for me, it's important. We'll get into this more in a minute. For me, it's important that it's on both the Mac and iPadOS. For you, probably not so much that. But I don't feel like all the things that we're looking for are really addressed by every single app out there. So I thought maybe we should talk about that. And the reason to me this is so important is that, we're both embarking on doing reviews over the summer. You'll be doing iOS and iPadOS, and I'll be doing macOS. And one of the things that I've found in the last couple of years doing the macOS review is that when I do it, what I tend to do, which is not ideal, is I just throw myself into it and do nothing else. And that's because without a great research tool that connects everything together, I find that it's easiest just to do all the research at once, get it all in my head, and then spit it back out on a page in a review. And that's really hard if you're doing a big review like these that we do in the fall. And that's, I think, why a research tool is important, because I'd like to, at least personally, I know you do a better job at this than I do, but I personally would like to start this earlier in the summer and have a way to kind of get back where I left off if I have to take a week off because I'm on vacation or if I'm working on something else on the site. I want to be able to kind of pick it up and put it down throughout the summer and not lose kind of that coherent big picture view of what I'm researching.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. The research for me, especially in early June, it's very tricky to explain because of all the different sources of information that I need to manage. And, thinking about the perfect research app, it's kind of impossible. I feel like what we're going to discuss here, it's more of, an aspirational type of product that is sort of impossible for it to exist on the App Store because, it would basically have to be the kind of app that would only work for you and me, and specifically for the stuff that
Right.
we do at Mac Stories. But basically, the big picture of what I would like to see is something that works for web pages, works for PDF documents, works for video, and works for mind maps, and works for all these things together, which I totally understand why it's not the type of product that would necessarily be successful on the App Store, because you do all these things at once, but you don't actually optimize for any particular feature. So I have accepted the fact that I always have to use multiple apps for the job. And I think I agree with you when you say that I don't necessarily care about having a component on the Mac. Although I don't, if the app that I use for research is also available on Mac OS, it's not like I'm unhappy about that. It's just that I prioritize iPad and iPhone for sure. Native apps on the
Right.
iPad and iPhone, and because I don't want to use a web app, and I only use a Mac like a couple of times a week. So
Right.
yeah, it's basically sort of the angle that with which I'm approaching this discussion is I need to collect information from multiple sources, specifically PDF documents, web pages, and videos, and also links from like Twitter and RSS. So I think it's impossible for the perfect app to exist, but maybe this discussion could be an exercise in explaining the specifics of what we would like to see, and maybe if you're the developer of one of these apps, maybe there's some details that you can implement in your
Right.
in your product.
Well, and I guess a couple of things. One is for me, the Mac is especially important for this particular project, which is the Mac OS review, because I spend most of my summer working on the Mac much more so than my iPad or iPhone, just because I'm reviewing the operating system on the Mac, and so I need to be on it. Also, I I've thought a lot about, and we've talked about this on this show in the past about the distinction between do everything apps that try to do
Right.
everything and be everything to everyone and individual apps. And I do feel like research, while we're talking about an idealized research app, I do feel like there are like a few categories you can break this topic down into that can be separate apps. But one of the things that's most important, if they are separate apps, is that they interoperate. And we'll get into some of the specifics there, but I feel like there are a lot of apps out there right now that don't do a particularly good job of taking the information that they create or collect and getting it out of those apps in a format that works elsewhere. And that actually is really important. And the three areas I guess we should start with in terms of talking about this are collecting
Hmm.
information, organizing it, and then annotating and reviewing it. Those to me are like the three stages of any research project. You're finding the information, you're putting it in some kind of organized system that makes sense to you, that's flexible, and then you're applying some of your own thoughts to it through annotating and reviewing it and pulling out what you think is most important. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Things from Cultured Code. The two-time Apple Design Award-winning Task Manager has been designed and engineered in Germany since 2007 and does a fantastic job of incorporating the latest technologies on the iPhone, iPad, and Mac. Today, I want to focus on the Things iPad app, though, which is a great example of what can be done when an app focuses on getting the most out of one of Apple's devices. A great example of that is the groundbreaking keyboard support that was added to Things in 2018. That support extends way beyond keyboard shortcuts. In fact, the entire UI is fully accessible without ever touching the screen. There's a lot of interesting innovations here, and they're truly unique. For instance, one feature called Type Travel allows you to navigate to a task list from one of them to another just by starting to type. It's so efficient and smooth, the entire process feels like magic. It's also the feature that led us at Mac Stories to award Things the Mac Stories Selects Award for the Best App Update in 2018. You've really got to try Things on the iPad to see how this works because the feature is absolutely astounding. Now, in 2020, Things is back with another great update that includes trackpad support for the new system pointer on iPadOS. The pointer magnetically hops from on-screen element to on-screen element, so you can navigate buttons, checkboxes, and all the other parts of Things really simply. There's also new right-click context menus for fast access to Things features. And on top of that, Cultured Code has implemented swipe gestures, making navigating using the trackpad super fast and efficient. The iPad has quickly become a laptop replacement for many people, and Things is right there at the forefront of the evolution, leading the way with innovative features that make it a shining example of the very best in app design on the iPad. Best of all, though, Things is just a terrific tool for managing every aspect of your work and personal life. Whatever it is you want to accomplish, Things can help you get there. To learn more, head on over to thingsapp.com right now or search the App Store and download the app today. I'll put a link in the show notes too. But again, that URL is thingsapp.com. Our thanks to Things for their support of the show. So why don't we just kick it off by talking about collection? And here's where my first wish is for an app called Devon Agent, which is available on the Mac, to be available on iOS and iPadOS.
Which is not Devon thing. It's a different thing.
Exactly. Same company, different app, only available on the Mac. It is kind of its own web browser, but it has a lot of tools built into it that make it easy to find, do complex searches, find information, and export it out into DevonThink. And it's an app that I've used a little, not a lot. And the reason I haven't used it a lot is primarily because it's not on iOS, because a lot of the research I do is on iOS. I do like, my iPad is where I do most of my reading. And so if I'm doing research, I like to sit down on the couch and start browsing through web pages, watching videos, whatever it happens to be, looking at Twitter and RSS, and then move that information somewhere else. I may work on it on my Mac later, but I want to start out. I almost always start out on my iPad. So having an app like that on the iPad would be really nice.
Yeah, especially because of all the advanced features that it's got, like saved searches and those advanced Boolean operators. I think it uses the same engine as DevonThink when it comes to searching and combining search queries with operators like near, for example, which allows you to do things like search for this particular word on a web page, but only if this word is near another word and maybe by something like 10 words or 10 characters, for example. You can get you can perform these extremely fine-tuned searches, both with DevonThink and in this case Devon Agent, for matching content from multiple web sources. It's really a fascinating product that it's the kind of pro app that I would also like to see adapted to iPadOS, especially with things like integration with shortcuts and maybe an extension to pass data, for example, from Safari to Devon Agent. And of course, the ability to export everything to DevonThink, or maybe open a Devon Agent folder as an external location in DevonThink would also be an interesting idea. This is the kind of, when I look at the Mac market for productivity and research apps in this case, this is one of those utilities, one of those pro utilities that always comes to mind of like, here's a company with a series of pro tools available on the Mac that I would really like to see on iPadOS as well. And of course, the folks at Devon Technologies, they've been busy relaunching DevonThink with version 3 last year, and now DevonThink for Mac has already reached version 3.5, and I believe they're focusing on the iOS version now and the iPadOS version, but they have a whole catalog of basically Mac stuff that would also be, in this case, Devon Agent, it would be fantastic to have on iPad. Like I could imagine myself, for example, connecting Devon Agent to things like Wikipedia and Google, and maybe add like additional websites as data sources. I mean, I would love to have that type of workflow where Devon Agent can search Mac stories for 10 years of articles. And, if he finds a match, allow me to keep a copy of an article of mine for reference. Right. It's, that kind of stuff is still so cumbersome to do on iPad, especially when it comes to archiving web pages and storing research material. Basically, our only option so far is to either save as PDF or save as a web archive, which we mentioned before. Devon Agent, that kind of scan the web and archive everything that you find and have like multiple ongoing searches going. It's one of the features that I would really like really like to have on the platform, including, for example, another from DevonThink. One of the features that is missing on iPad and iOS right now is the ability to index RSS feeds. And that
Right.
would be extremely nice to have on iPad, because on the Mac, what you can do is you can set up DevonThink to monitor an arbitrary number of RSS feeds and archive all those new articles and items for each feed as, I believe, web archives or HTML pages. And that feature is not available on iPad. And I would really like to have it there as well, because I don't want to leave my Mac running every single day of the week to have this option, to have this feature.
Yeah, no, that would be nice. And I guess barring a standalone single purpose app like that, I think one thing I would like to see more developers do is have rich share extensions that allow for items to be saved in various formats and in various places. And one thing I'm thinking of, and as you mentioned, DevonThink for the iPad is being worked on now. It's in beta. And one thing I'd like to see in that app, for instance, is a better share extension on iPadOS, because on the Mac there's a share extension too, and it hooks into the menu bar app, which gives you a really broad set of tools in terms of the format you save it in, the database you save it in, whether there are tags and stars and labels and other sorts of metadata that you can attach to it. And you can just fill that all out as part of the share extension without having to, go in and open up DevonThink itself, which is really handy and would be useful on the iPad as well.
Yeah, and on the topic of saving things from an extension, I also think it's always beneficial to have actions in shortcuts that allow users to put together their own extensions. So that, usually with extensions, and in this case, like I'm thinking of DevonThink and I'm thinking of Evernote, for example, they have limited options in terms of, yes, you can save data from Safari or other places, but maybe you cannot tag items upon saving them, or maybe you cannot choose a destination folder, or maybe you cannot add a comment. And I feel like with actions in shortcuts, I could put together my own extension for the share sheet that saves data into that application, but also allows me to add as many fields, as much metadata to the new item upon saving the item right there as I'm saving it, as much as possible. So Keep It, for example, is one of the apps that gets this right on iOS and iPadOS. Keep It as a large suite of modern shortcut actions, all based on parameters. And I've used them in the past. I've used them before. And they do let you essentially create your own save menu for Keep It if you don't want to use the extension, which is one of the better extensions for this type of product. But if you want, you can make your own, and you can have as many fields as you want. You can make a menu that lets you add tags or comments, or change rename the item before you save it, and pick the collection that you want to save it into. So I think shortcuts actions can be beneficial for those users, for those power users that maybe don't want to use the default share extension on the iPhone and iPad.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because that's the sort of thing that allows an app to avoid trying to be too much to everyone. Instead of having a share extension that has 15 items in it that have to be filled out or can be filled out, you can allow the users to customize it to their own needs, and that way simplify the app, but make it flexible enough that people can make it as complex as they want, depending on what they need to do. So that's a great point. Why don't we talk a little bit about organization, because I know that you and I have both kind of done different things.
I do have one more wish before we talk about organization.
Okay.
I don't know if this is ever going to be possible, but while we are talking about our perfect research app, again, potentially not a thing that can actually exist, but I would really like to be able to not choose a format when I'm saving a web page. And I'm thinking of, like, we've been talking about DevonThink and Keep It and saving web pages both as web archives and as PDF documents.
Right.
And I kind of wish that it was possible to save a web page as both, and then later choose which one you want to edit or which one you want to annotate. again, I don't know how this could be done in terms of like what does it mean if you want to save an item as two different representations, and especially in the case of DevonThink, because DevonThink is also a file provider extension in the Files app. What does it mean if you save a web page that is both a PDF and a web archive? Does it mean that you actually have two files in your DevonThink database, or does it mean that it's like a proprietary format that you can no longer open in Files? So it's a very tricky thing to do. Maybe you mentioned in our notes, John, that maybe something like Text Bundle for the web could be a thing. And of course, Text Bundle is this proprietary format that allows Markdown documents, which are normally plain text documents, to also embed things like images and research material inside of them. And apps like Ulysses use Text Bundle to have like these documents, these sheets that actually contain additional data in addition to plain text.
Right.
Maybe something like that for the web could work, because we mentioned this many times before. The differences between PDF versions of web pages and web archive versions of web pages. One of them is a faithful replica of the full thing. So the web archive is the actual web page saved offline. The PDF version is not necessarily as loyal to the original web page as a web archive, but it can be annotated. It can be, you can do highlights, you can add comments. And I just, I don't want to choose between them. I want to have both. And so I every time I use DevonThink or Keep It, or, last year I used Evernote again, I always wish, just let me save this web page as a web page item, and then let me pick the representation that I want to edit or annotate later. But maybe this is not technically doable. So
yeah, DevonThink on the Mac, you can convert between formats.
Yes, exactly. So
now I have not spent a lot of time with that, so I don't know how good it is if you move from, say a web archive to a PDF. But it is possible, and they have a lot. I mean, you can move between Markdown and and HTML and PDF and web archive. There's a whole bunch of different options there, and that would be that's a little different than what you're suggesting, but it would be nice to have something like that as well.
Yeah. And I think I actually had another. Sorry,
you do.
John.
No, it's all right. Go for it. This is a good one.
Yeah. So this is kind of a weird one, though. So do you remember the old dashboard widget that allowed you to like clip a portion of a web page? And
I do. It was like a little mini window onto a portion of a web page.
Yes, and people would use it to do things like, this is before, of course, like menu bar apps became popular on macOS, for example. But people will like clip a portion of like their local weather forecast webpage and turn it into a weather widget for their area. Or like they would clip a portion of the apple.com store page where you can see all of your orders. And this was before like the deliveries widget, I think. And they will keep an eye on their online orders that way. And I kind of wish that, of course, dashboard is gone. And I'm not wishing for the return of dashboard. Although, if you listen to the latest episode of Connected, you know that maybe actually that is the one from last week. We talked about the return of dashboard. Still, my idea is basically let me clip. All I want is an extension that allows me to clip a portion of a web page and actually keeps the look of that snippet of the page, just like the old dashboard widget. So don't just let me clip text or an image. Like actually clip the whole thing, like with the CSS and the style and the format, but just that portion of the page. Again, just like the old dashboard widget. It's like taking a screenshot of a page, right, of a web page, but it's not a PNG. It's not a screenshot. It's an HTML clipping. That's
right. It's a live page. It's just a portion of a page.
Yeah. So.
All right. Well, I jumped way ahead on you there, Federico. Do you have any other wishes? For
no, I'm done. Let's talk about organization. Sorry.
All right. No, I'm sorry. We should talk about a couple of different things. One of them is file managers, and the other is note-taking apps. Because I feel like when you're organizing your research materials, there are a couple of ways to approach this. And I think you and I have used maybe hybrids of both of these at different times. And file managers are the apps like DevonThink and like Keep It, where you can stash all sorts of different files, but they're more than like a Finder folder or, a folder in the Files app. it's something that has to have some other tools for organization around it, whether that's things like inline notes or tags or just powerful searching, especially save searches, which Keep It does and DevonThink does. And I know you're a big fan of that. And you don't see it on iOS, unfortunately, as much as I'd like. But what are your thoughts on that these days? Because I know you also use Apple Notes as well, right?
Yeah. So note-taking apps I dislike as research apps because they're only good for text and images. And
right,
when I do research, as I mentioned before, I have all kinds of content that need to be aggregated in one place. That's a good word to describe it. Aggregate different types of content in a single location. And so I do use Apple Notes, but I save like comments and maybe sometimes links in Apple Notes. But those are part of a bigger effort to collect research material, which again includes PDF documents, includes full web pages, includes maybe even email messages, maybe screenshots, all kinds of things. So I've always been more inclined toward using something like Keep It and DevonThink. So the file manager oriented type of product.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always felt like this happens every summer when I work on my iOS review. I don't want to keep notes in Apple Notes forever. Apple Notes, to me, any other note-taking app, really, it always feels like a place that I need to empty over time. I don't want to keep notes in there forever. And I know that this is very much unlike other people. I know Ryan, for example, he has like thousands of notes in Apple Notes.
Oh, yes, tons, yeah.
And actually uses it as a database. And I don't see Apple Notes as a database. All the things that I have in Apple Notes, unless they are like collaborative shared notes that live over and change over time, but all my other notes basically have, at least in my mind, expiration dates attached to them. Like I don't want to keep them in there forever. To archive material indefinitely, I do prefer something like DevonThink or Keep It or last year Evernote, but that type of product. That, yeah, my note-taking app, I don't want to keep research material and like PDF documents or stuff like that forever in there. I want to make sure that it's always lean and like less than like 100 notes for sure.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess I do a little bit more on the reference end, although not to the degree that Ryan does. I do have various notes for different projects, but I do get rid of them and pare them down pretty frequently. Like if I have a one-off note about an app that I'm reviewing, I'll delete that eventually because I just don't need to keep that information around. But I'll also have collaborative notes that, for instance, you and I might be working on something and we're keeping lists of things that we need to do in the future. I have an awful lot like that. I also have idea notes where they just evolve over time, where it'll be ideas for stories and things like that. And as I write something that's in one of those notes, I just delete that bit of text out of the note, and it changes over time. So it's kind of a hybrid, but I know what you mean in terms of what's good to store in notes. Mm-hmm. It does work well with links. It does work well with text. But once you start attaching large PDFs and other things to it, it becomes too hard to really get at the contents of the PDFs in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So there are a series of sort of must-have type of tools and features that I always want to see in a file manager-based research system. If you don't mind, I have quite the list here, John.
Go for it. You've been thinking about this a lot. We've both been, the thing about this episode, Federico, is you and I have been, I think, obsessed with this for about the last month, and so we absolutely just had to get it out of our system.
No, and honestly, like if I didn't have a career in writing and doing podcasts, and if I were not to go with my backup option, which is like open a farm and live with lots of animals and dogs, my third choice would actually be write the perfect research app because it is something that I really care about. Or I guess I should also put competitive Pokemon player in there somewhere in the list.
Yes, you should. Somewhere, that's probably like number 2.5.
No, I think still the farm with lots of animals, like a dog shelter. Oh man, that would be awesome too.
Oh, okay, all right.
Maybe when I retire.
You learn something new about Federico in every single episode, don't you?
Yes, yeah, I guess that is true. That is true.
I've never known that you wanted to have a dog farm.
Well, lots of dogs, but also other animals, because I think all animals are good to us humans, even
Yes.
more so than they should, because we are horrible as humans. So yeah, animals are good. Anyway, that's off topic. So the obvious ones: tags, folders, saved searches. We've talked about this so many times before. The ability to mark something as a favorite. Keep It gets this right. You can mark a file as a favorite. You can mark a folder as a favorite. All of these organizational tools, however, they should also be supported, at least in my opinion, by a customizable sidebar. So I'm a big believer in having a sidebar that lets you switch between these different areas, these different sections. But I want the sidebar to be fully customizable. And I'm so surprised by the fact that so many apps to this day in 2020, they still don't get this idea of like, allow me to fully customize the sidebar and let me change the order of like what's at the top. Like, do I want folders at the top? Why? I want to have tags at the top of the sidebar. Why do you force me to have folders? So let me rearrange all the sections of the sidebar and let me put whatever I want in the sidebar. Do I want to put a saved search? Why not? Do I want to put a collection of tags or maybe shortcuts to reopen a specific file? Sure, let me fully customize the sidebar. So folders, searches, saved searches, tags, and favorites, and let me rearrange them however I want in a sidebar. I feel like, especially when you have the type of app where you archive thousands of files and random bits of text and screenshots and images and documents and web pages, it is essential to speed up navigation as much as possible.
Yep.
And the best way to navigate that whole thing is a sidebar. So keyboard shortcuts. I mean, this is kind of obvious. And if you can make the same set of keyboard shortcuts consistent across the Mac and iPadOS, even better. Pointer support. I feel like this is, just a must-have on iPadOS at the moment, to have proper integration with the native pointer, with support, maybe even support like multi-touch gestures, something like the two-finger swipe in IA Writer to show and hide the sidebar
Right.
with the library. That's very nicely done, and it's the kind of idea that I would like to see in more products. And I feel like there's other iPadOS specific things that I should mention, like context menus, which I'm glad to see adopted more and more, especially because context menus natively integrate with the long press gesture and the pointer right click on iPadOS. So it's very nice that more developers are adopting context menus. Drag and drop is another one. Maybe files integration, it's also another one. Again, Devonthink and Keep It get this right because they allow you to browse their full database structure also in the Files app. So it's a very nice secondary option if you want to open your databases and browse them in Files. But I feel like I need to specifically call out, once again, advanced searches and the ability to save those searches, because it's mind-boggling to me that so many apps still consider, including Apple's, with notes and reminders and mail, they still consider saved searches and advanced searches to be a Mac-only functionality. So
Right.
let me search and find content based on multiple criteria. Let me search inside the content itself, and let me choose. Do I want to match, do I want to search the title of an item? Do I want to search the content of an item? Do I want to search both at the same time? And in addition to this, so of course, if you ever use the saved search feature of Finder or Mail on the Mac, you know what I'm talking about. Let me add multiple criteria for composing a saved search. IA Writer is actually one of the few apps, along with Keep It, that allows you to do saved searches on iPhone and iPad, actually. In addition to this, I also want to mention, let me navigate search results with a keyboard. Don't force me to touch the screen, and I'm talking specifically about iPad here. And also make sure that you highlight search results. Like if I'm searching for a word, make sure that that word is actually highlighted when I'm switching between
Yes.
search results. So many apps,
Absolutely.
they bring up a list of matches, right? But then they don't actually show you where inside the document you got a match.
Right, and then make it easy to hop from one search result to
Exactly.
the next with the keyboard so that you don't have to go scrolling through maybe a 20-page document to find the second instance of it.
Yeah. So these are, do you have anything to add in terms of, like, when you mentioned this one, I never use this feature, status markers. Like, do you actually use this?
Well, you know what? I when I say that, that's a general term to me that works just like favoriting something, which you talked about a little bit before. All right, some sort of way that's just like an on-off switch that lets you mark something is, sometimes you see it in apps as read or unread, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me in the research context, but other times you see it as favorited, and I think I like it better as a favorited type of concept, but it's the same sort of thing. It's just a marker of some sort to highlight a particular piece of content, whether that's in your sidebar or imaginary sidebar or somewhere else in an app like this. But no, I don't really have much else. I mean, you've covered it all. And I think that it's, I think the theme that goes throughout all these things that we're talking about is flexibility, the ability to be able to do things quickly and be able to move around easily, whether you're using a keyboard or the Apple Pencil or your finger or a Mac or whatever it is, be able to move around quickly and find things and set them up the way you want and the way you like and the way you think.
Highlighting and taking notes.
Yes.
We mentioned this before. My primary wish in this case is just, once again, I wish that I could highlight web pages in the sense that
right.
either as an extension in Safari. And I know that plugins exist on the Mac. Like if you use Chrome, there's these highlighters that you can install as browser extensions. And those, they do get the job done. But I primarily wish for somebody to invent a system that allows you to highlight web archives, basically. Again, maybe it's not technically possible, but so maybe that will never exist. But if we're talking about PDF documents instead, I feel like more apps should do what highlights and margin note. And spoiler here, we're going to be talking about margin note and some amazing discoveries that I made in margin note for iPad in an episode of Mac Stories Unplugged, which is our club Mac Stories members only podcast. So stay tuned for. It's going to be a very nerdy discussion about things that I discovered in Margin Note 3. And John, I told John just a couple of hours ago.
Yes, and he kind of blew my mind, really.
Yes, so we're going to be talking about Margin Note in Mac Stories Unplugged. But for PDF documents, I wish more apps would do what these two implemented, which is a split screen mode for viewing the document and your notes at the same time. So both highlights and margin note version 3, they have a split screen, like an in-app split screen mode, which is not to be confused with multi-window or like the actual split view, that lets you view the document that you can highlight and annotate however you want, and your notes, all of your notes from that document on another side of the screen. And if you tap on the note, you can actually jump back to that note in the document itself. It's very nicely done. And I wish that more apps would do this. Instead, most apps like Devonthink, for example, on iPad, and I think it's the same on the Mac, they don't have a standalone split screen view for your highlights and your notes. They just let you highlight the PDF, which is fine. But in terms of research, I like to have that bird's eye view of all my notes, all my highlights from that document.
Yeah, it's kind of the difference between a traditional PDF app, which has some sort of annotation tools baked into it, versus a PDF research tool. And that's where I think, that's where Margin Note and highlights really distinguish themselves. Because I had someone ask me recently, why don't I just use PDF Expert? And yeah, PDF Expert's a good app. The thing is, because it does have annotation tools too, they're just not as extensive. I can't, I want to be able to clip images. I want to be able to pull the text out of the PDF and then out of the app altogether so I can go into my notes if I want. All those things are possible with like highlights, but they aren't available to the same degree in all PDF documents. So that's really, to me, what's most important. Again, it's that flexibility of being able to both pull information out of a PDF, but also to be able to find that information in context, as you said, with some sort of link back to the original document. And as far as web archives are concerned, the closest thing I've been able to do, and I too, I'm familiar with the extensions and the plugins you can use with things like Chrome. I don't want my tool to be tied to just one web browser, though. So that doesn't really work for the way I work. I have tried things like Instapaper, which that's something that I wrote about last week in the Club Mac Stories weekly newsletter, because I did find a way to, using IFTTT and shortcuts, to highlight and take notes and comments on articles saved in Instapaper and then extract them into Apple Notes. But that's also a little bit one more step than I would like. I would just like, as you, to be able to open a web archive, have a good representation, a faithful representation of that website, and be able to mark it up some way. That would be terrific. But we don't really have that. So that's why I think you and I both have been exploring more dealing with PDFs for this year's research projects.
Yeah, especially because PDFs, like if they have multiple pages or if they have multiple chapters, most apps, they tend to offer like a navigation tool that lets you easily jump between chapters, which is not necessarily something that you can do with web pages, right? With web archives, PDF documents, you can have the outline and the table of contents, and you can use that to move between chapters. So yeah, I am gravitating towards PDF documents this year for all the things that I want to save for the iOS review. I feel like we should also mention taking the data out of those apps and exporting your notes, exporting your annotations to other formats, to other apps. Again, Highlights is an interesting example here because the app comes with you actually reviewed this one on Mac Stories, but it comes with integrations with other apps. So you can actually export your notes from Highlights to something like Bear and Devonthink, right?
Yes, and also Evernote, I think, as well.
Nice. Yeah. Margin Note also has an Evernote integration. And I was looking in the forums, and of course, there's a few folks who were like, hey, can you actually add support for exporting data to Devonthink? So maybe hopefully in the future, also Margin Note will have a deeper integration there. But yes, I do believe that it's important because it's research, right? And it's something that is instrumental to additional work that you will be doing in the future, likely somewhere else. So I think it's so important that you should always be able to take your data out of your research app and bring it somewhere else where you can actually continue working, whether it's a text editor or a word processor or, I don't know, a scientific calculator, like whatever. You should always be able to take all of your notes and highlights and your data out of your research system, make it portable, and take it somewhere else. And on iPadOS and iOS, I feel like developers are more receptive to the importance of this idea. Not so much on when we're talking about web tools. I mean, you look at something like Notion, which I know that a lot of people love, but John, you do have that experience of you wanted to take data out of Notion and you ended up with what was that, like a zip file with hundreds of plain text files with raw syntax in them.
Yes, it was, and it's partly the way it's designed because it deals with these blocks of content, which is a very web-like type of interface, and as a result, it was not really possible to just extract certain sections or headings and everything under them. I had to extract the whole thing, and then I had to go in and unzip it and then kind of copy and paste the text out from every single text file. And, part of that is because it also deals with images and tables and a bunch of other things, but it wasn't a good experience. I mean, you and I gave it a shot for a project we were working on, and it was fine at first while we were using it, but I just found I like the idea of what it can accomplish. I don't like using the app because it's such a foreign app in terms of the iPad experience or even the iPhone experience. It's just so far afield to me from the usual experience that I felt like I was fighting it all the time. So that's not really for me either.
Yeah, and on the topic of web tools, just one last thing that I wanted to say. My ideal research app is available. I mean, you also mentioned the Mac, but for me personally, on iPad and iPhone, and it's a native app. I am not interested in web-based tools because maybe I'm old-fashioned like that, but my web browser is for browsing the web. It's not for working in web apps. I appreciate the progress that has been made for web apps. I think it's incredible that, and folks use Google Docs and Notion, and I respect it. I know that it's a thing and it's totally fine by me. I just prefer on Apple platforms the experience of using native apps. And that is why every time I get, recommendations from people about Notion or this new service called Roam, ROAM, Roam
Right.
Research, those are Roam, I think it's web only, and Notion is not web only. They do have an iOS and iPadOS version, but it's so behind the web version. It might as well be like a separate thing. I'm not interested in that. I don't wanna use a web browser to organize my research stuff. I want to use the native apps that have native keyboard shortcuts and native behaviors and support for multi-window and drag and drop and shortcuts, right? I like working on Apple's platforms and I like using native app features, and that is why I don't want to work in a web browser. My web browser is for opening Mac stories and reading the news and occasionally watching YouTube in a browser, but that's it. Like I don't know about you, John, but I don't want to work in a browser personally.
No, I feel the same way. I spend enough time in a browser doing the reading and the research. I don't want the apps to be in there as well.
Exactly.
And
yes.
And it might make us old fashioned in a sense, but I've always found, at least for the way I work, that I'm more likely to find a tool that works best for me when I'm looking at native apps than when I'm looking at web apps. And that's just, maybe that perfect web app will come along at some point, but so far I haven't found one that I like as much as a native option.
So once again, if the Mac Stories thing doesn't pan out, if the career as a competitive Pokemon player doesn't pan out, if I don't open a farm/dog shelter, we can consider the business of making the perfect research app.
I think so. We could become app directors, Federico, and find ourselves a developer who knows what they're doing.
You saved that for the end. No,
I did. All right, Federico, I gotta end it right there. Okay. Yes. So that's it for this week's episode, everyone. I want to thank our sponsor again, and that's Things by Cultured Code. And of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico's on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.